Happy Monday, everybody. Might be a little late getting this one out, but every Monday I like to go over my best of one, best of three meta review for Standard in Outlaws of Thunder Junction. So we're on to week 7, and no budget decks to start things off here, but we do see a new archetype make its way into the best of 3 tournament scene. So Orzhov Midrange by Victor Carvalho got first place in the Standard Challenge 32, and with a Orzhov Midrange, and we haven't seen Orzhov Midrange in the top 3 of the Standard Challenge tournament since week 3 of Lost Caverns of Ixalan. And just really quickly, I like to track the changes throughout the weeks because I think it helps kind of understand what some of the alternative options were and what direction people have been taking it for those who like to be pay attention to the small details. So they've dropped the Ambitious Farmhand, the Deep Cavern Bats, Lord Skitter, Shieldred the Apocalypse, down 1 copy, and instead are bringing in the Caustic Bronco, which we got at Outlaws of Thunder Junction, the Tenacious Underdog, the Graveyard Trespasser, the Aclazot's Deepest Betrayal, and leaning a little bit more into the Planeswalkers, so Liliana of the Veil, as well as Sorin the Mirthless. And 2 copies here of Invasion of Gobekon, which can really affect your opponent's tempo. And so notably, because of the inclusion of, so like a higher creature count, some more low-costed creatures that pack a little bit more oomph than the Ambitious Farmhand and the Deep Cavern Bat, looking to apply more pressure rather than disrupt your opponent and then win through enchantments later. So we're also cutting the, we're bringing in 1 cut down and cutting out 2 Destroy Evils, as well as bringing in a Go for the Throat, so upping the creature removal, but getting rid of the Restoration of Agonjo and the Virtue of Loyalty and the Virtue of Persistence, which was kind of the late game strategy for this, that it was sort of similar to Esper Midrange with the Wedding Announcement and the Virtues of Loyalty and Persistence, was kind of giving you this, like, eventually you're going to overrun your opponent. And this one kind of increasing the clock against your opponent, but then also playing the Planeswalkers, which can be difficult for your opponent's interaction. Also deciding to bring in 3 copies of Duress in the main, which is good against the Azorius Control, which is quite popular in the meta right now. And then as far as the lands go, we've dropped a Gonjo, Mirix, and some Plains, and the Restless Fortress, and a Swamp to bring in a Concealed Courtyard, which is the fast land for Orzhov. And we brought in 2 copies of the Mishra's Foundry. Again, instead of Mirix, Mishra's Foundry, showing again that this one is kind of almost like a aggro build rather than strictly mid-range. And 4 of the Shadowy Backstreet, which is the Orzhov tap land or Surveil land. And as far as the best of 3 sideboard goes, we can see that they also did a very large rework here. So we dropped the Razorlash Transmigrant, the Anoint with Affliction, Cut Down, Destroy Evil, Duress, Parasitic Grasp, Sunfall, and the 3 copies of Invasion of Gobekon to bring in 2 copies of Get Lost, which really helps against the Golgari midrange. Gives you Planeswalker and Enchantment Hate. 2 copies of the Pest Control for Boros Convoke. 2 copies of Liliana of the Veil, which also helps against the Golgari midrange. And then 2 copies of the Lauren of the Third Path, giving you some more enchantment hate. 3 copies of Path of Peril, so there's 5 total wraths that we can bring in against Boros Convoke. And then Tokashia's Welcome, for if we want to kind of increase the deck's ability to outvalue a mid-range opponent. Second place was taken down by Mono-Red Aggro by Jorge Elias. And but we're going to skip that one because it's the same list that I covered in week 6, except for they cut a Mishra's Foundry and brought in a Mountain. So unless there's at least more to talk about than that, I'm just going to skip it. And but third place was taken down by Azorius Control by Raydan. And if we compare this to the lists I covered in week 5, we do see some changes. So we've brought in an additional copy of the Tishana's Tidebinder in the main, as well as brought in 1 copy of Sunfall, ditched the 1 Farewell, and cut Jace, the Perfected Mind, and brought out 1 Field of Ruin for 1 Mirix. And we're going to see a couple of signals, I think, that kind of showcase that the Temur Control or the Temur Landfall deck was not as anticipated of a matchup in the standard tournament scene. One of those is that Elish Norn, Mother Machines, was cut, which also hits Boros Convoke. We got the Hullbreaker Horror, which was taken out. Brought in an additional copy of the Kutzel's Flanker, and cut one of the Tishana's Tidebinders for the main, instead favoring into the 3 copies of the Stoic Sphinx. So if you go back and you look at like my Esper midrange or Azorius Control matchups, there's a couple matchups where you're going to want to bring in some of your bigger threats. So like your classic one was the not the Chromos Sea Shark, but the one that can bounce things that I'm blanking on. Anyway, just this hexproof, once it gets on the board, it can be really problematic for control to deal with. And then we've got Get Lost is coming in to give us a little bit of enchantment hate. Again, this one's particularly good against Golgari midrange. The early interaction Golgari midrange can struggle with a little bit. Again, if you want to know more specifics about each matchup, I highly recommend my best of 3 sideboard guides. And but we did drop the 2 copies of Rest in Peace, which is another signal I think that Temur Control was less anticipated, and the the Sunset Revelry, and instead brought in the March of Otherworldly Light, which is a particularly good one to have against the Boros Convoke because you can hit their token that they're trying to hit with Gleeful Demolition. And for first place for the other standard challenge that happened on Saturday, we have Gruul Aggro by Darth Kid. And if we compare this one to the list I covered last week, we do see some substantial changes. So ditching the Cemetery Gatekeepers that we saw coming in from Mono-Red Aggro, originally by Mogged in Week 9 of Murders at Karlov Manor. And instead, we're running 1 copy of the Kinra Spell Spear. And we've seen this one in Best of 1 kind of as an alternative, works into the Prowess kind of synergies. Dropping the 4 copies of the Ancestral Anger, the Audacity, the Giant Growth, the Snakeskin Veil, and the 3 Lightning Strikes to bring in 2 copies of the Twin Inferno to give something double strike for an OTK, 2 copies of the Witchstalker Frenzy for some removal, the 3 copies of the Demonic Ruckus, which works with the Slickshot Show Off, being able to give it menace and kind of fits into that kind of Prowess strategy. And we're dropping Boseiju Who Endures for an additional Sokenzan Crucible of Defiance, and 1 Restless Ridgeline. And as far as the best of 3 sideboard goes, we can see that the continuation of the Cemetery Gatekeepers, also dropping the Gatekeepers from the sideboard, brought in another copy of In the Festivities for against Boros Convoke, and so signs here that both decks were anticipating more matches potentially against Boros Convoke. And then cut the Lithomantic Barrage as well as the Urbrask's Forge. We still have some Urbrask's Forge in the sideboard, but just 2 copies. And because 2 copies are in the main. And we've also got Witchstalker Frenzy down 2 copies, but still keeping 1 in. And then the Snakeskin Veil that was being run in the main is now put into the sideboard. And we have 4 copies of Strangle, which again I think is really for the Golgari midrange matchup. Third place was taken down by... the second place was taken over by the Orzhov Midrange by Parrot. I'm going to skip that one, though, because it was the exact same list as the one that we just covered by Victor Carvalho, even down to the sideboard. Third place was taken down by Azorius Control by Noob, and it is doing enough different that we still have some interesting things to talk about. So if we compare this one similarly to the Week 5 of Outlaws of Thunder Junction, we can see that this one decided to drop all of the copies of Tidebinder from the main. Again, if I can remember off the top of my head, Tidebinder is working particularly well against the Planeswalkers of Azorius Control, and bringing Hullbreaker Horror into the main, which I think, again, if you go back and you look at it and you look at the ones that have the larger threats, Hullbreaker Horror is a great larger threat that if it sticks to the board, you kind of win that game. Similarly, though, to the other Azorius Control list, dropping the Jace, the Perfected Mind, so both top 3 Azorius Control lists deciding to not go the mill route with Jace the Perfected Mind, and also dropping 1 copy of the Wandering Emperor and 1 March of Otherworldly Light, so only down to 2 here, to main board in 2 additional Get Losts, dropping the 1 Depopulate, bringing in a 3rd Sunfall, but deciding to keep Farewell, which the other one dropped. And again, Farewell kind of giving you this ability to attack graveyards, which can be helpful against the Legends deck and the Temur Landfall, Temur Control deck. So, also bringing in 2 copies of the Devious Cover-Up, which really, I think, is additional exile. Same with No More Lies, gets rid of those recurring problems, is good against the Memory Deluge and such. And then you can also loop it so that it prevents the mill strategy from your opponent. And as far as the lands go, we're dropping a Darker Waste, Mirrex, and bringing in a Demolition Field, which is kind of like Field of Ruin number 5, and 1 Seachrome Coast, so faring the fast land instead of the pain land for Azorius. And then the best of 3 sideboard, we see that they also decided to drop the Chromehost Seed Shark and the Elish Norn and the Hullbreaker Horror. Decided to bring all of the copies of Tishana's Tidebinder into the sideboard, dropping the Get Losts because they got brought into the main, bringing in a 3rd copy of Negate, and cutting both copies of Rest in Peace, similar to the other list. Again, maybe this is just because Temur Control was less likely to occur, or they're both leaning into the unlicensed Hearse instead of the Rest in Peace. But dropping the Sunset Revelry and the 2 copies of Temporary Lockdown, so this list only running the 2 Temporary Lockdowns in the main, not bringing in more for Boros Convoke. And but bringing in Dinnik, Pious Apprentice, which can block graveyards from being the target of spells or ability, so there is still some disruption for Temur Control and the Legends deck. And then, like I mentioned, bringing in the 2 copies of the Unlicensed Hearse, and sideboarding 1 Wandering Emperor into the sideboard instead of in the main, and then 2 copies of the Boonbringer Valkyrie, which we saw in the Pro Tour for Azorius Control, being able to give you some lifelink can help stabilize against that early pressure. And now for best of 1, and I like to use a third-party tracker called Untapped, and according to that tracker, number 1 was Boros Convoke. And if we compare this one to last week, we can see that we've dropped the Charming Scoundrels to bring in Lunarch Veteran, which is particularly helpful against Mono-Red Aggro. Generally, at the beginning of a season, you see a surge in Mono-Red Aggro, as everybody's just trying to climb to Mythic as quickly as possible. We're also bringing in 1 copy of the Regal Bunnycorn. Again, I can't remember off the top of my head which matchups this is a good one to bring in, but I did cover it in one of my Boros Convoke sideboard guides. And then we're dropping the 4 copies of the Case of the Gateway Express to bring in the 3 copies of Warleader's Call. This is generally a signal that Azorius Control is a little bit more popular. Since there's a surge in Mono-Red Aggro, Azorius Control can be built to be pretty oppressive against Mono-Red Aggro, and then this deck can kind of account for the Azorius Control by bringing in the Warleader's Call. As far as the lands go, we've got a Gonjo, Mirrex, a Mountain, Sokenzan, and Sundown Pass that was cut for the 4 copies of the Inspiring Vantage, which is the fast land for Boros, and then 4 copies of the Cavern of Souls, which also points to maybe an increase in the Azorius Control matchup. Mono-Red Prowess was number 2, and if we compare this one to last week, we can see that the Fugitive Codebreaker got dropped down by 1 copy, deciding to cut both copies of the Kenra Spell Spear and bring in 2 copies of the Phoenix Chick, and 3 copies of Godric as the top end, and 2 copies of the Demonic Ruckus, so bringing this back up to 4. And to make room for it, we're dropping the 2 copies of Twinferno and the 2 copies of Case of the Crimson Pulse, bringing in 2 copies of Shock, and cutting the Mishra's Foundries and 1 Mountain to bring in Sokenzan Crucible of Defiance. Mono-White Humans took number 3, and this one we've got 1 last copy of Recruitment Officer, ditching the Skrelv Defector Might from the main, and bringing in 2 copies of the Warden of Inner Sky, so bumping that up to a total of 4, and then cutting the 2 Intrepid Adversaries and 1 Thalia, Guardian of Thraben, to bring in and Sanguine Evangelist to bring in the 1 more copy of Knight Errant of Eos, and the 3 copies of the Hopeful Initiate. I haven't covered this one since week 5, so it's been 2 weeks, not a substantial amount of changes, but bringing in the Hopeful Initiate here, which can give us some more enchantment hate, and then 1 copy of the Spellbook Vendor, which we've seen this one kind of come and go from the lists throughout the weeks, as well as the Werefox Bodyguard. So both of these kind of being the Wilds of Eldraine additions to the mono-white build, seeing some spotlight this week, dropping Ossification down to just a single copy, and then bringing in an additional copy of a Gonjo, cutting the Cavern of Souls, which kind of goes against what we saw in the Boros Convoke deck that was bringing in the Cavern of Souls. This one's cutting them. So much for that, right? Dropping the Mishra's Foundries in lieu of Mirrex. And usually Mirrex is a better counter to the Control. So kind of weird to see that the Cavern of Souls got dropped from this list, but it makes sense if you're going to be bringing in alternative non-humans like the Werefox Bodyguard. So that might have to do with it more than the anticipating Azorius Control in the latter. Because Mirrex, I think, kind of points to anticipating that. And then bringing in 2 more copies of Plains. All right, and then number 4 was Bant Poison, and this one hasn't been in the top 8 according to the tracker since week 4 of Murders at Karlov Manor. So we have to go back a ways for that one. But this one you can see is kind of leaning heavily into the lower end of the curve, so we're dropping Jawbone Duelist and Annex Sentry. Notably, we're dropping the Fading Hopes, which has usually been the best interaction for this matchup against Mono-Red, so I thought that one was kind of curious. Bringing the Skrelv's Hive up to a total of 4, and this one again being a pretty good answer to Control if you can get it down early, anything that doesn't have the enchantment removal. And then we've got excuse me, then we've got 2 copies of the Getaway Glamour, which I thought was a really great addition for this deck, because you can target your Venerated Rot Priest and blink it, as well as it being removal. So you kind of get this double utility of the spell in this archetype. And then we're bringing in 1 copy of Bring the Ending, as well as 4 copies of the Reasonable Doubt, so leaning much more heavily into the counterspell kind of space. And as far as the lands go, we're bringing in 2 Adarkar Wastes, leaning more heavily into the Painland, dropping the Deserted Beach and a Gonjo for an additional Mirrex, cutting the Otawara and the Razor Verge Thicket and the Ovmea Coast for Plains, and 4 copies of the Botanical Sanctum, which is the land that we got in Outlaws of Thunder Junction. And I don't know why they're ditching the Agonjo and the Otawara. I feel like you could be running that instead of a Plains and an Island. It is going to go away during rotation, so maybe they were testing out the deck for after rotation, but that doesn't make sense. Never mind, I take that back, because March of the Swirling Mist is leaving. So I'm not really sure why Agonjo and Otawara aren't in this list. And then we're going to skip a couple of options here. So we've got Rakdos Aggro was number 5, but hasn't had enough changes since week 5 for me to really talk much about it. It dropped a Sokenzan Crucible of Defiance for a mountain. And then Gruul Aggro I'm going to skip as well. It was number 6, but it was the same exact list as the one that I covered in week 5. And then Mono-Red Aggro here was number 7, and this one was deciding to drop 1 copy of Godric Cloaked Reveler for 2 copies of the Charming Scoundrel, dropping Chandra Dressed to Kill as the Planeswalker, and dropping a Sokenzan Crucible of Defiance to bring in a mountain. And then last but not least here we have number 8 is Orzhov Lifegain, and generally when you see an increase in Mono-Red, you see an increase in Orzhov Lifegain. And so this one, very similar to the list that I covered previously many weeks ago. I actually didn't write down which one it is, but the Ellis Ilkor Sadistic Pilgrim got dropped down 1 copy, bringing in the Resplendent Angel up to 2, and then dropping 2 Plains and 2 Restless Fortresses to bring in 4 copies of the Concealed Courtyard, which is the new land that we got at Outlaws of Thunder Junction. I think it was week 2 in Outlaws of Thunder Junction that I covered the Orzhov Lifegain. Doesn't really matter. So let me know what you guys think. Always love to hear back from you guys. I hope you guys like listening to the tracking throughout the weeks. I know some people, it's a little bit more detail oriented than they would like. They would prefer more of just like a broad overview of what the deck is doing. But a lot of these decks I've already talked about, and so talking about them over and over each week, you know, I can only describe the basic strategy of Orzhov Lifegain so many times before it kind of becomes repetitive. So I know I get a lot out of doing this process. It helps me, I think, understand the standard meta at a deeper level. So I hope it does that for you as well. So take care, everybody, and I'll see you all next week for another Best of 1, Best of 3 meta review.